I think in retrospect, it was a totally insane, reckless, irresponsible, stupid decision to buy that painting. I absolutely couldn't afford it. Only in a world of art could I seem like a class outsider. If you say, "Hey, that's weird. This is 500,000, but these seem to consistently sell for 100,000 at auction." The response is, "You shut your mouth. You're not supposed to be a insider professional. That's our job. We do the sales. You shut up and give us money."
Welcome to Vita Brevis, a podcast about business, art, life, and death. I'm your host, Carlos Cardenas. Here we explore how business, creativity, and philanthropy intersect through the lives of remarkable people. I talk with entrepreneurs and community leaders who are passionate collectors and visionary patrons to discover how art shapes their work, purpose, and legacy. Because life is short, but art is forever.
Vita Brevis is here to entertain you. Nothing discussed here should be taken as financial, investment, or legal advice. Views expressed are personal and for general discussion only.
Hello, everyone, and welcome again to Vita Brevis. I feel very fortunate today to have Jeff Magid on the show. Like a lot of you, at some point not too long ago, Jeff's just started showing up in my Instagram feed, and it became more and more regular. And sometimes he was talking about specific artworks or specific anecdotes, regarding the art world, sometimes about the market, sometimes going off on cultural tangents that always seem to come back to art. And at some point, like many of you, I had a kind of a quiet realization that this guy is actually a pretty big deal. So, Jeff, thank you so much for coming on.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, wonderful. Well, listen, before we begin, I just wanted to get your thoughts on the premise of this show, of Vita Brevis. So, Vita Brevis focuses on patrons whose engagement with art is fueled by economies outside of the art world, right? So, theoretically at least, no dealers, no artists, no museum professionals, just people who have built careers elsewhere and who have brought that energy into the economics of culture. So, having understood that before you get on, what were your thoughts about this premise?
I like it, and I think that, it's interesting. I even like the title, if I understand it from the idea that, life is short, but understanding art and also the durations of learning art are long, is something that I feel like has all kinds of interesting applications that we could go in many different directions about. And yeah, I think it's interesting. And I also would say that I agree with the idea that it's something that I've been vocal about, but I will continue to be, which is that um, I don't believe that the world of art is entirely about the making of art. I think a lot of what happens in what we understand as the life and the culture and the history of art also comes down to all of the rest of us who appreciate it. That it's not just the artist that makes a work that defines a work. It's also about the gallery that shows it in the museum it ends up in and all the people that come and see it and what they talk about. So for me, I'm very interested in perspectives of all kinds of people, not just the insiders of art, and definitely not only the person that's so inside to the work that they made it. I like hearing perspectives of people uh, from the outside, both in their professional life, but just in general.
Well, it's something that's kind of interesting, I think, about the art world is, in a way, it almost seems it's a world that's exclusively by and for insiders in a way, you know? I think a lot of sort of, you know, cultural industry contexts sort of have, an audience. And then you have on the other side the sort of maker production side. It seems like most people involved in the art world, and of course there are exceptions, but they tend to be on the kind of insider side of things. If you go to art fairs, for example, on opening day, I mean, it's going to be almost exclusively professionals in one way, shape, or form. So I think it's interesting to kind of open it up to this idea that there can be a sort of an economy outside the art ecosystem that can actively participate within it.
Agree. And
Yeah.
and, uh, and I'd say if anything, if I had to define my project in art going beyond just, what you were describing, we didn't know each other until relatively recently. If you're describing just knowing of me recently in the past year, it's because a year ago I started, making more public, writing comment videos about art. As of a year ago, I hadn't done any of that, and partly I think if someone were to ask me what my MO or mission in doing that is, it's exactly to what you're describing. My goal is to make art more accessible to more kinds of people, bring art to more kinds of people, and also bring more kinds of people into art. And if someone were to ask, what's my role in it? Why am I qualified? Why am I an insider enough to be able to do that? My first answer would be that I believe partly why my perspective is interesting, if one finds it interesting, is that I'm not an insider. In fact, I'm a total outsider, and to me, that makes it exciting because I think that a lot of the ways that media has approached art before is it shows a world of insiders for insiders. So if you're someone who's looking at the world of art and was curious about it, but it didn't really find a place to enter it, even to learn, part of what I'm saying is come along with me. I was a total outsider too, and we can enter this world together. And what I'm trying to do is not really to be an art critic or any official capacity. What I'm trying to do is figure it all out. I'm trying to figure out how things work, and I'm sharing my process. So I'm really more interested in understanding ideas than I am, giving an official comment. For that, I think it's great that you know, Roberta Smith, great critics are more qualified to comment on than that. I'll share my ideas and opinions, but really what I'm trying to do is figure out how things work.
I get the impression that, and correct me if I'm wrong, or, we'll get a chance to hash some of this stuff out, but you've definitely sort of rubbed some people the wrong way, I think. I think this is a risk whenever you have a large audience, and you've clearly developed a pretty large audience. You're not gonna please everyone all the time. It almost seems like you've sort of crashed the gates of a private club, that the art world has done its best for decades, if not centuries, to kind of protect and insulate itself. And you have found a way, through technology and through a large soapbox, so to speak, you've been able to sort of, slowly chip away at this sort of barrier. Do you think that it's, this idea that maybe someone like yourself doesn't belong, but you sort of push through anyway? How do you negotiate that idea of busting through these barriers?
I mean, I'd say it's something that I've cultivated because in a way, only in a world like art could even one make the case that someone like me might find that they don't belong. At the end of the day, I'm a highly educated, uh, white male, graduated with an Ivy League degree. I know my way around a lot of different conversational topics and feel comfortable in almost any room. Um, so only in a world of art could I seem like a class outsider. So to me, that's part of the divide I'm trying to draw. The truth is that actually I would have guessed more people would react negatively to me opening the curtain about a lot of things. I'd say for the most part, it's been received really positively, especially even by super insiders, and the kind of, mega powerful people in art. Have mostly reached out really positively. It's really, to be honest, the only, negativity I think I've received is coming from a different place, which is just that it's a very strange thing that in having not just in the proper art world, but even just having to do with anything to do with art in general, there are very few public personalities, public intellectuals, personalities in general. So I think that someone who might have hoped that they would be the public personality might find it frustrating to see someone else have an audience. And I can understand that. But that doesn't worry me too much. But I think that I'm also in an unusual position because at the end of the day, I don't really have to fear anyone. I've spent my time in art and paid my dues over more than a decade, and really all my only role in art otherwise is to collect. I can't be fired as an employee of a gallery or museum or auction house because I'm not one. On the other end of the spectrum, uh, a lot of the powerful entities even if they maybe quietly don't like me so honestly sharing, at the end of the day, they also have to acknowledge that I'm someone who's contributed and continues to contribute a lot to this ecosystem. So I think that's the other advantage that I have is that I'm very clearly not, just a content creator. I'm creating content in a way that hasn't been done before, which is I'm showing the life not of a someone talking about, for example, the art market, but the actual moments in the life of someone who's a participant. So in that sense, it's a bit harder to say, "You have no right to say this," because in the end, I'm not really turning the camera on anyone else but myself. So in that sense, that's kind of, what I've enjoyed doing is I'd feel a bit strange, outing someone else, but thus far, the only person that I expose is my own life, my own doings, and I share them honestly and in a fairly vulnerable way. And so I think someone could disagree. The most common comment I've gotten, is someone says to me, "Man, I watch everything you do. I disagree with some of the things, but I watch everything." And to me, that's great because, that's part of, uh, I'm sure I would disagree with some of the things too that almost anyone should I'm not expecting anyone to agree all the time, but to me, I'm trying to get at and provoke meaningful conversations. I'm not hoping for, 100%, agreement.
I know that you've embraced the term influencer. What was there ever a hesitation around that?
Oh, it's a good question. I'll embrace whatever you wanna call me. That I've decided the moment that I turn the camera on myself, I couldn't be scared of anyone attacking me, insulting me, trying to expose me, and in that sense, I feel really lucky because at the end of the day, I've had a relatively good and fortunate life. I'm not scared of anyone calling me stupid or ugly, or describing or misunderstanding what I do. And partly why it was worth deciding that is I know that comes with the territory. That as soon as I almost think that when you choose to reveal yourself publicly, there are really only two things that can happen. You can start to gain an audience, in which case people will insult you, detract you, try to tear you down, or maybe even worse, you don't reach any audience at all. So, I figured most likely I wouldn't reach any audience at all because that's how most things go. But if I did, I had to be ready for people to, not just to insult me, but also to misunderstand me. So, I'm aware that a lot of the things that I do reach people who think, "Oh, this is some vlogger person who's just describing stuff that they don't understand." With a 30-second Google, they could figure out that wasn't the case, but that's alright. I can't at the end of the day, in the same way that the singer of a song can't tell the listeners they need to listen to a song a certain way, I just have to be prepared that people will understand or not understand what I'm doing in various ways, partly just because of the fragmented way that people get media, that, you just get a little clip of something and you say, "Who's this guy? Oh, what's he doing? I don't know," whatever, and that's just how things appear to you, so I'm okay with that. People will as I reach a wider audience, people will understand it and or relate to it or disagree with it in various different ways. If they want to belittle it in some way, that's just fine too. But also, I'm just not in a way, I think to be insulted by being called an influencer would be a sort of embrace of a kind of ageism or sexism, that there's the idea that either I could be, a powerful, wealthy art collector, which is maybe befitting of a, like, older man, or an influencer, which is befitting of, like, a cute younger woman, and so I'd have to be embarrassed to be called an influencer because that's what a little girl would be called who's saying,
Mhm.
"Get ready with me while I put on my makeup." If that's what someone wants to group me in with, fine with me. If you if this seems like a makeup tutorial to you, that's cool. That's how you wanna
That's
see
on
it, that's
you. Yeah.
yeah, and that's at the end of the day, and which kind of goes along with my philosophy of art, in the same way that I'm talking about how artists aren't just the only controllers of the meaning of their work, in the same way I realize that what I'm making, I won't be controlling the meaning of. If someone wants to say, "Huh, this guy's okay, but to be honest, it's kind of a mediocre makeup tutorial. Wasn't how I intended it, but that's how you see it, then that's how you see it."
Let's step back before art. I know that you've essentially been, a sort of self-employed entrepreneur from what I gather. So tell us about your sort of previous professional lives.
Yeah, I mean, I've done and continue to do a bunch of different things. I'm a writer and songwriter and musician. I've written various things. I wrote songs for years and, had a music group and also was a solo artist and songwriter. I had a music studio in Los Angeles. I've done things in writing, creating, and music for a long time. And I'm also a game player, professional game player, and gambler. I was a chess player as a child, and then I became a player of Magic: The Gathering. For anyone out there who's familiar, which is interesting actually, because it's maybe my first experience in something that people tried to embarrass me for, because it's a very nerdy game, and I felt like I should be embarrassed to love it as a kind of middle schooler going on high school. I would travel to play in the Magic: The Gathering Pro Tour, and even my friends at the time sort of thought, "You sure you want people to know this about you? Don't we want to be cool?" So it's sort of you have to be, but given that I went to play in the Magic: The Gathering Pro Tour, I just kinda had to face the reality. Am I just gonna hide who I am, or just deal with saying, "You guys, if you think it's embarrassing, that's on you." But yeah, so I played games, and then when I was in school for philosophy as an undergraduate, I took on a bunch of student loans. And accidentally, through people I knew through chess and Magic: The Gathering, who were serious game players, they introduced me to online poker. So I became an online poker player, both through school and just after. I was about to go to graduate school, and maybe get a PhD, but instead I realized I was able to pay off my student loans and make a better living in any way that I otherwise understood, by playing poker on the internet. And so I, for a while, played, uh, in poker games, both when I was this has started before I was 21, but then when I became 21, I started playing, poker games in casinos, and then also eventually in private games, in hotel rooms at people's homes by invite, which was maybe my first experience with the world of network-based opportunities where, because basically a lot like art, it turns out that actually the winningest poker players are not the best poker players. The winningest poker players, or the people that have the best poker lives, are the people that have worked their way into knowing the right people to get invited to the games. So it becomes immediately much more important how good you are at shaking the right hands, knowing the right people, being in the right places, building relationship-based opportunities in order to get invited to play. Because around the time that I graduated college and a bit after, all of the highest stakes games moved from the casinos to private invite only games. So then quickly a lot of my job became trying to get invited to games, and it wasn't something that I was terribly good at, in part because I wasn't terribly interested. The truth is I like figuring things out. I suppose the question people ask me is, through different fields, is what makes someone good at this field? And to me, that's an important question. I'll bring it back to art a bit because it's another thing I feel very strongly about, which isn't talked about enough or almost ever. In art, we know that making art is something that is totally subjective, and yet is a pursuit that, in doing it, as a maker of art, as a painter, as a songwriter, any kind of art, even though there's no right and wrong, there's no best and worst, you still are working, hopefully, to be your best, to constantly improve yourself, and to be better than you can be, better than you were yesterday. Even if there's no best, there is a bettering. And why I say that is, for some reason, though, in other aspects of art, it's talked about almost the opposite way. That, for example, they'll release like top art collectors in the city, or top 100 art collectors, or whatever. But then if you ask someone, well, what makes someone a top art collector? They almost describe it as if it's not a skill, as if it's not something that it's a pursuit that you can get better at. They describe it as if, well, I suppose the top art collector is just whoever spends the most money, I guess, or they buy a lot. They just buy stuff all the time, indiscriminately. So I guess they're the top art collector? This is something I feel really strongly about, that the opposite is the case, that even in subjective things, even in things that are creative and have no wrong or right, that if we're talking about them, if you can make a best albums of the year, that means that you can strive to be your best as a musician. And ditto, if there is a top collectors list, that means there's some skill that's happening, and it's worth defining what the skill is, what's the pursuit. And so to me, when people ask me what it takes to be good at each of these fields, the main thing I think is that, for me, the thing that's carried me forward is I have a tremendous desire to figure things out. I'm a determined learner. I wouldn't be better at math than everyone in the PhD program, or wherever else, but I'm totally determined to learn about things that interest me. The other hand, for example, so I was a totally determined learner of of how to play poker and games, but the truth is I'm not that determined learner of how to suck up to the right people socially. That just doesn't interest me very much. So I had a hard time when the world of poker turned to just knowing the right people, even though some people find that tremendously interesting, the kind of world of social networks and society and how to be the most efficient socialite, for example. I was more interested in the strategy of how to play the game, the actual game. So I didn't last that long as a pro poker player. And then I also made models for predicting the outcome of sporting events. And I've continued in writing. And I suppose my biggest interest in life is writing and words and ideas.
Amazing. It's a lot of stuff. Tell me about the sort of different business models because these are all quite different, you know? I can imagine that for the songwriting, it's all about royalties essentially, right? Volume of airplay and then royalties. Um, Correct me if I'm wrong, but how does that work for, gamification? And you mentioned, a sort of probability engineering kind of was this a software focused activity, or tell me about the probability piece as well?
In sports, I made models for predicting who would win the games. So it was, yeah, it was algorithmic and involved probability, but also some subjectivity, weighting the values of different things. A lot of it was trying to identify which factors do and don't influence the outcome of a sporting event. It sounds like pure statistics or pure math, but a lot of it is actually just trying to understand the world. Which and there's if anyone wants to hear an interesting podcast, it's worth listening to someone who was a colleague and someone I really looked up to and admired, named Geralbus Bob Vulgaris. He was the world's best basketball bettor, and he did a podcast recently with Pablo Torre, where he talks pretty honestly about what went into being a winning sports bettor. And it's really interesting because it's even though there's a lot of number crunching involved, a lot of it was he just had a very basic realization about what was affecting the scoring in basketball games, and it wasn't, the square root of pi. It was actually something observational about how the game was being played. Specifically, how scoring changed when people were at different ends of the court, whether they were next to their home bench or away from it, and how close the coach was to the team's defense physically. He observed it and then tried to figure out mathematically if it was true. And those are the types of things that I was doing, more focused on baseball, but I was trying to figure out which factors mattered in who would win a baseball game.
Do you use any of these strategies as a collector?
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I'd say I use those ways of looking at the world and many more. I think that's one of the things I like about art is it's really an intersection of and by art I mean the part of art that happens after the artwork is already made. I don't know what anyone wants to call it, art world, art market, art whatever, but those things I think are a really interesting intersection of pure creativity and pure analysis. And anyone who tells you don't do analysis is lying. All those people do analysis. All the people who collect and they say, "Oh, I just think about it very purely." They're lying. They think about it purely, but in relation to all the other things they've seen, they're thinking about whether this is an especially good work of the artist in relation to other works they've seen. They're analyzing all kinds of, they're just not calling it analysis. They're calling it subjectivity, but it's always both.
Thank you for listening to Vita Brevis. If you know someone who would enjoy this conversation, please share it with them. A follow or review also goes a long way in helping us grow. Thank you. And remember, life is short, but art is forever.
So let's step back a little bit and talk about how art entered your life. So I know that you mentioned, I imagine in a post, that it was about 13 years ago you bought your first artwork. It was a Henry Taylor that you bought at Blum Poe in Los Angeles. So I want to know, like, what took you there in the first place, you know? And then the next step would be, why did you want to own an artwork as opposed to just experiencing it whenever you wanted?
It's a great question. What took me to art in the first place was sort of an accident. I was aware of art, obviously, and I'd been to a museum before, but I didn't really have any family background, friends, connection, mentor. But I did have awareness that there was a world of art. But the thing I was especially not aware of was there was an active world of people who were living and even maybe my age. I was in my late 20s at the time, and I had never been to a gallery, a show opening, any of those things. But But I met an artist, Slater Bradley, who's a really interesting and good artist and a great guy, and I met him totally by accident, through music, and he's also involved and interested in music, and then he invited me to an all artist poker game. So I went to a poker game in Brooklyn, at the studio of an artist called Dirk Scraber, and we played poker for, like, $1 and $5, but I was ecstatic because, I was just curious about a world that I had no contact with before and didn't even know existed, and they all talked about their lives as artists and their processes and stuff, and I thought it was really interesting. I just was and, I maybe went once a month, but I was just excited to know people in a different world. And when Slater and we'd hang out some other time, I remember saying to people, "This is my friend. He's a modern artist," and he said, "Contemporary artist," and I said, "Oh, cool." I was just glad I knew him. I was like, "It's cool. I met a modern artist." I figured that was the beginning and end of my relationship with art. Is that I just was a fun story, fun bit of a world to know. I had drawn, in like drawing class in 4th grade, and I wasn't that good at drawing. I've always been much better at words and ideas. I say to people sometimes, I'm not really a visual person, and they look at me like, "What?" Because I've so much of my life has become visual now. But I'm really not a visual person. I'm a words and idea person. So it never occurred to me, I never was exposed to conceptual art. I didn't think that I could, meeting these artists in this room. One of the things that was interesting to me is some of them didn't even make art with their own hands. They made conceptual things executed by other people. This was all just blowing my mind because none of this even seemed possible to me. It wouldn't have even occurred to me there was any role for me in this world. I just was glad to have exposure to something new. And, it was only with starting with Slater and Dirk and a few of the guys there. Susumu Kamijo was one of the people there, a painter. They all sort of said, you could collect art." And I remember thinking, "Really, me?" But first they said, "You should come to a opening." So I remember the first opening I went to was the opening of Cory Archangel at Teen Gallery, and, it totally blew my mind because it was not what I was expecting. I don't know what I was expecting, but I was maybe expecting, like, a museum gala. I didn't realize it would be a informal group of younger people, drinking PBRs and, talking about conceptual art. That world just never crossed my radar. So yeah, and then little by little, I started meeting artists, and then when I moved to LA, I started playing in the all art poker game in LA, and there I met my first gallery owner who was Jeff Poe, and because he was playing in the poker game, and also both of the first couple of artists that I met, Slater and Dirk, both were represented by Blum and Poe at the time, so they referred me to Jeff and the Blum and Poe people, and I went to their shows, and eventually I bought a painting from Blum and Poe, and that was kind of the beginning of my. Even then, I didn't feel like a collector, but at least that was the first artwork I owned.
So what was it about Henry's work in general, and then, that piece in specifically, what made you pull the trigger and say, "Hey, I'm gonna own this. I'm not just gonna enjoy it and think about it and talk about it. I'm gonna take this home with me."
I'd say some of it was, I mean, there are 2 ends of the spectrum. There's what it was about the work and the artist, and then what it was about myself. So maybe I'll start with the work and the artist. It definitely was a. I think about this as a really lucky moment, and I think I've talked about this before publicly, but it's worth saying again. I got really lucky that night because I went to the dinner. Again, I had never been to a gallery dinner, and the dinner was at a place, I wonder if it still exists, in Venice, California. It was kind of a white tablecloth, sort of serious place, and wasn't that many, 3 or 4 kind of tables of people, mostly very adult, quite a bit older than me, wealthy seeming people, and the people that worked at Blum& Poe, including Blum& Poe themselves, and Henry Taylor, and me. And, I immediately was sort of aware that I didn't really fit in, uh, and I'm sure Henry Taylor was aware that I didn't really fit in, and instead of just thinking, "Who is this guy? He's not anyone important," he was super nice to me, welcoming. We chatted a while, but he also kind of, like, welcomed me into his conversations and was just a kind of interesting, off the cuff, kind, smart, unpretentious guy. And the fact that that's the first artist that I met who wasn't already a friend was really lucky because I think I've met a lot of people in a lot of scenarios first who are who are really different than that. So I think that was part of it is, I really liked the painting and I really believed in him. So there's that. I mean, I think that's not just why I bought that painting. It's also one of the reasons why I continued in art is because one of the first people I met didn't laugh me out of the room. He was instead, really welcoming. And I just loved the painting, and I think it helped that I felt personally connected to it, and I felt like I maybe understood it is the wrong word, but it didn't feel I connected to it genuinely. So and I remember having this conversation in my own head. The first couple of artworks that I bought, I thought to myself, "Man, this is really a lot of money." Especially the Henry Taylor painting was a lot more money than I expected at the time. I don't know what I expected, but when they told me the price, I thought, "Man, it's a lot of money." In retrospect, also, it was really a lot of money. But I remember thinking to myself, "Well, you know what? Though I really, really like this, and if I go broke later and this is all I have, I'll be okay with it because I like it, you know? And in retrospect, I think if I didn't really have anyone to ask their opinion. Had never met an art collector. So, or someone that was familiar with how to evaluate one's financial position. Remember I was, a 28-year-old online poker player. I didn't really have anyone to talk to or ask about this stuff. And I think in retrospect, it was a totally insane, reckless, irresponsible, stupid decision to buy that painting. I absolutely couldn't afford it. Uh, it was a really big part of my life savings and net worth. It was an irresponsible purchase. It was way too much money for me to afford, but I didn't know that. So that was part of it. And I think another thing that helped is that I really could feel that this was a world that I both wanted to find my way into and that also I didn't have an easy way into. I knew that Blum Poe was a really big deal gallery, and people really made it clear to me I was lucky that they wanted to sell something to me, being a total nobody. So I wanted to show them, "Look, I buy things." So I think that was part of it. Uh, so most importantly was that I really loved the painting. Second, that, Henry was such a welcoming and interesting guy. Also that I knew that I couldn't just keep showing up and not buying things, that I basically at some point I needed to buy something. And so this was just me saying, like, even though I knew in my heart I couldn't really afford it, I was gonna just show them like, yeah, I'm gonna be part of this world. But also I think that it's worth noting that probably the biggest factor is just I was already really comfortable with risk, so that's a big not just risk, but financial expenditure. I think that's the hardest thing is that for people that are used to selling and buying art, galleries or frequent collectors, they almost talk about these purchases as if you can make them just casually. Most people can't, and he was not a super well-known artist at that time. Now he's museum decorated and admired and applauded around the world. At the time, it was not the case yet. So I just sort of figured,
Mm.
the hell with it. But most people don't have
Uh,
that scenario.
this whole topic brings up, quite a few complicated and interesting issues. So, artwork, we're talking about objects of contemplation, right? Um, we're looking at value that is created through emotion, maybe beauty. I mean, these pretty abstract concepts. But as you just mentioned, it doesn't exist outside of an economic framework, right? I mean, these are expensive objects of contemplation, not necessarily, but it can certainly be the case. So it's interesting because the idea of making or exhibiting artwork is, treated as something very noble, as it should be. But then selling artwork is very suspect. There's this idea that participating in the space is great, as long as you're just not selling art. Why do you think being on the commercial side is kind of viewed in a suspect manner?
Yeah, I mean, and I would add to that, it's partly why I so proudly and earnestly talk about these things is that I'm very aware that it's not just selling or quickly flipping or quickly cynically profiting off of art that people view in a suspect manner. It's even the considering the cost of something as a financial cost that people don't want you to talk about. That I want to point out that in thinking about, for example, I often say to people, um, some of what I'm trying to do in art is discover and find things that I can buy before the price goes up. And they look at me and say, "Why, huh? Is it because it's a business to you? Is that what it is? Is if you're just gonna," but I say, "Just think about it for 1 second. Why might someone want to buy something before the price goes up? I'm gonna tell you why. It's so that I can afford it. See, if I don't buy something for 10,000 and then you make it 1,000,000, I won't be able to afford it. And I really like this artist. So I'm going to try to buy it while I can still afford it. But for some reason, a lot of people don't want that to be part of the conversation. And I just deeply disagree. And I think not just the thinking about what you can afford when you buy it, but even zooming out and thinking, who is art for? Who can afford it? Even at each level. And at each point, there's a big question, even among people that have significant disposable wealth. It's worth remembering that as an artist, as a gallery, whoever it is setting the prices of each show, at each level, you double the prices. You keep a bunch of people out. That's that many fewer people that can afford the work, and that's just a reality, and that's not about flipping or art as an investment or whatever. I just listened to Susan and Michael Hort, who are legendary collectors and, interesting thoughts on whatever, and they're very frank about it. They say, "We buy up to," "we buy very quickly and early, partly because when the prices get too high, we're priced out." It's a very real thing. Maybe we'll make an article about this sometime soon. There was something strange that I just realized today. I was just reading an article, because I still follow the kind of world of sports betting and poker and stuff news a bit once every. I think mostly just because I'm a news junkie. I can't help but like learn about things as I go. And there was an interesting article talking about why, even though sports betting has become pretty legal, a lot of people continue to bet overseas in ways that have questionable legality. And this is why. Even though sports betting is legal in many US states, the casinos are allowed to just cut you off, restrict you just because you win. In fact, they're very open about the fact that it's not about like counting cards or anything like that, that just by being an astute winner or even someone who's focused on doing it with a great deal of study and therefore making skillful moves, you are not welcome. The only people that are welcome as a customer of the casino, you're allowed to be in one category. You come and just spend your money, you don't get too engaged, and you come and lose your money and shut up. And in a way, that until very recently, that's how the world of art has been presented. It's not just that you're supposed to not be a quick flipper or not be someone who's cynical about art and doesn't even appreciate it and just sees it as a financial object. All those things are true. But also you're not supposed to be thinking about the price or if it's a fair price when you buy the work. That's also true. But there's even something further. In general, you're given the message, this is our world. We're the professionals. You are supposed to be a kind of casual amateur. You come to an art fair or come to the gallery and you spend your money and you shut up. You're not supposed to learn too much about this. You're not supposed to, if you say, hey, that's weird. This is 500,000, but these seem to consistently sell for 100,000 at auction. The response is, "You shut your mouth. You're not supposed to be a insider professional. That's our job. We do the sales. You shut up and give us money." Um, and so that's, and I realize in that sense, it's very similar. And I know obviously why that is. In a very short-term way of thinking of things, casinos think that's more profitable, for example, and so do some art galleries. But what's interesting is another way that these worlds are similar. It's pointed out in this article that actually the most successful sports books now work very closely with their sharpest, meaning the most skillful, because actually it turns out it's a very short-term way of thinking to try to keep people out for learning too much. And actually, it's much more useful to work closely with the customers who are also very learned in the field. And what's interesting is, as people get older and then die, you start to hear more acknowledgement in people like that in art. Like when Leonard Lauder died, over and over people say about him, you know, he really knew a tremendous amount about these fields he was very focused in, sometimes more than us. Sometimes it was really useful for us, the people that were, the main dealers of these artists, even though he wasn't a dealer, to work closely with him. So I think people are starting to learn that actually a world that discourages people from being deep thinking connoisseurs, not just about the artist's history, but also about the market. It's better if you're about to open a show where everything is priced double what it's worth, then in the short term, it might be, and I can see why it's self-serving to tell people now you don't think about the market. That's our job. But in general, I'm certainly out there encouraging people to be knowledgeable, informed, lovers and buyers of art. And I can see in the past why people have discouraged it, but I disagree.
Yeah, well, it says something about how privileged we are in the art world and, the sort of position of power, especially that a lot of the gatekeepers have. So it almost seems like it's Oh, a strange bourgeois guilt that we built up in the art world. Like this idea that something as pedestrian as economics is somehow beneath us. We're, thinking about things in very abstract, almost philosophical terms. Something like money is just seen as maybe crass or something like this. So, like I said, it just says something really interesting about privilege. Something about the art world is somehow supposed to be immune to any kind of economic need. It's ultimately self-defeating. In a way, it's not a good look, and it really just sort of uh, um, makes us seem all that much more privileged and isolationist. So, definitely an interesting problem, but definitely a problem.
End of part one. Please come back soon for part two.